Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. So we've got another True Crime Tuesday, and like I said in my last one, this is related to the Black Lives Movement, and this is the case of Stephen Lawrence, who was killed in a racially motivated attack by a group of white boys. And I am linking stuff in the description, so please go and check that out. And this case is taking place in the UK, proving that the UK is not innocent with racism in the police force. I'm going to stop talking and just get on to the case because it's quite a long one. So Stephen Lawrence was born the 13th of September 1974 to his parents Doreen and Neville Lawrence, and they had travelled to the UK in the 60s from Jamaica to get a better life, and they moved to Greenwich, and this is where Stephen was born. And at the time of Stephen's murder, his dad was a carpenter and his mother was a special needs teacher. He was raised in a place called Plumstead, and his parents had 2 other children. He was the eldest of 3 children. So they had Stuart, who was born in 1976, and Georgina, who was born in 1982. Stephen was very athletic. He was an incredibly talented runner, and he was in a club for it. He was in the Cambridge Harriers Athletics Club, and he took part in competitions with them. And on top of this, he was also a really creative guy. He was super artistic. He just wanted to have a really positive impact on the community. And he even appeared as an extra in a film directed by Denzel Washington, which was called For Queens and Country. So Stephen was actually at 2 colleges. He was at Woolwich College studying English language and literature, and Blackheath Bluecoats College studying technology and physics, and he wanted to become an architect when he was older. So on Thursday the 22nd of April 1993, he was having a normal day. He was at Blackheath Bluecoats College, and he was just having a normal day, and he decided to go with one of his friends called Dwayne Brooks, and him and Dwayne went to the shops in Lewisham, which was like a local town, and they were there for about an hour, and then they caught a bus to go to Stephen's uncle's house to just play video games and chill for a bit. Stephen's uncle did not live far at all. He lived in a place called Grove Park, which was like in the local area, you know, it wasn't like super far away or anything, so they didn't have to travel loads. It was just one bus there, and that's where they stayed until about 10 PM that night. But then they had to leave because Stephen had to be home for 10:30, and he was cutting it a little bit fine. So him and Dwayne left, but they realised they wouldn't have got home because it would have been one bus journey for Stephen to get home, but that wouldn't have got him home in time. So they decided to get 2 or 3 separate buses. They were going to like get some shorter routes to try and get them home faster. He normally got the 286 bus, but because he knew it would have got him home later, they decided to change buses to the 122 or the 161, but they arrived at Wellheath Road at about 10:25 PM, so we only had 5 minutes to get home at this point, and they were waiting for their bus, but the bus was actually running a little bit late. So Stephen decided to walk to the end of the road to see if he could see the bus coming or anything. He didn't go far at all. It was just at the end of the road, and he was near the junction at the end of the road on Dickinson's Road. Dwayne was still at the bus stop. He was part way between Dickinson's Road and the roundabout where Stephen was. Now he was kind of in the middle-ish of the road. Dwayne was still waiting at the bus stop. And then Stephen started kind of heading back, you know, he shouted over that he couldn't see the bus coming. So at the time that Stephen started kind of walking back to the bus stop, it was 10:38 PM. And at this point, Dwayne and Stephen both noticed a group of 5 or 6 white youths that were like in a gang, and they were walking along the road towards Stephen. So at this point, Stephen was kind of halfway to the bus stop from where he was before, but these youths, they started kind of shouting lots of racist slurs at him. They were being very verbally abusive, and they very, very quickly ran over to him and started attacking him. They forced him to the ground and stabbed him twice, once in the right collarbone and the other time in the left shoulder. Both of these were quite deep, about 5 inches deep. They severed lots of arteries, they punctured his lungs. So at this point, Stephen, he would have had no feeling in his right arm. He would have really struggled with breathing. And Dwayne realised that he was next because it was obviously a racist attack. So Dwayne started running and shouted to Stephen to run if he could, because, you know, they don't want to get hurt. And at this point, the boys all like dispersed. They all ran, and they ran in the opposite direction, and Dwayne and Stephen began running, and they actually made it quite far, 130 yards, before Stephen collapsed. And it is thought that he managed to run this far because obviously he was quite athletic, he had a lot of stamina, but it is still amazing that he ran this far when he had all these severe injuries. So obviously Dwayne was freaking out, and this was the 90s, so they didn't have cell phones, so he ran to go and like call for an ambulance. And a few minutes later a police car arrived, even though Dwayne had asked for an ambulance, and these police officers were no help at all. So all police officers are trained in first aid, so they can, you know, help victims. These officers did not help Stephen at all. They kind of just ignored him, to be honest, and they focused their attention on Dwayne. So they kind of presumed that they were part of a gang, or that Dwayne had attacked Stephen, even though Dwayne was telling them the story. They just weren't wanting to believe it. Police paid so little attention. They thought that he had a blow to the head and that's what was causing his bleeding, not two severe stab wounds. And like later on in this case, these officers were questioned to see like why they didn't prefer like do the first aid, and they said that they weren't trained in it when all officers should be. So like that's just one fault with the police. There's many faults with the police in this case. They're like, the police work is appalling in this case. Now whenever Dwayne was like being questioned by the police at the side of the road, still waiting for the ambulance, a Christian couple were walking past and they obviously saw Stephen lying on the floor bleeding out, and they went over to him, and the man in the couple, he started praying for Stephen's family, and the woman was holding Stephen's hand and was saying to him that he was loved, people cared for him, and this is what he thought he heard in his final moments. He was taken to the hospital but was pronounced dead before like he even got there, and his family were called within the hour, and they obviously went to the hospital, and his mum went in to kind of confirm that it was her son, and she said he looked really peaceful, like he was just sleeping, you know, he didn't look like he was in pain or anything. So they assigned an officer to lead this case, but this officer had a lot on his plate and he should not have accepted this because he knew he couldn't have done it, and within 3 days he passed it on to someone else. And this meant a lot of time was lost on this case, because so they had 3 days at the start where there was one officer on it. When it was transferred over, they basically had to start from scratch and catch the new officer up on the details. So they lost 5 or 6 days on the case here, which is crucial when it comes to murder investigation. Actual crime had 3 witnesses, so obviously Dwayne witnessed it, and there were also 2 other people at the bus stop, and everyone who saw it said the crime was not provoked, it was very short, that Dwayne had nothing to do with it as well, because the police was still focusing on Dwayne. And several people actually came forward with names for this case, and the same names will be repeated over and over again, and there were lots of tips. Some of them, like notes, were left on police cars, and even someone left a note inside a phone booth and told the police to check that phone booth. So people were obviously scared of these suspects, and they were fearing their own lives in case people knew that they would like turn them in. They were scared they were going to be next. So the 5 names that kept appearing over and over again were Gary Dobson, who was 17, and he was thought to be the brains of this kind of operation, you know, this gang. There was Neil and Jamie Aycourt, and these are obviously brothers. Neil is 16, Jamie is 17, and Jamie is the kind of the leader of this group. Luke Knight, who was 16, and David Norris, who was also 16. And David Norris was the son of a notorious gangster and drug dealer in the area. And all 5 were known to be involved in racist attacks before. They were known to be very racist people, and they all had like an obsession with knives as well, and were known for knife crime. And just a few weeks before, so Gary Dobson and Neil Aycourt were involved in an attack involving a knife and again racism. They were all known for these like racist attacks. There'd been multiple incidents before where they'd like, you know, been caught committing. Jamie was accused of stabbing teenagers Darren Witham in May 1992 and Darren Gills in 1994. Stabbings of 2 other people, Gurdeep and Stacey, who were stabbed in 1993, they were both linked to like them as well. Police had grounds for suspicion, so they could have arrested these boys, but they didn't. Instead, they put a photographer outside of this kind of abandoned house that the boys were known to use as like kind of a base for the operations. And this photographer should not have been put out there, you know, they should have had a police officer surveilling it, because the officer can like step in if anything happens. Caught one of the boys carrying out this massive like bin bag, putting it in their car and driving off, and the photographer could only take photos of it. There were no cell phones, you couldn't tell the police, you couldn't drive after them in like a car chase. If a policeman was there, he could have went over and searched him, you know, but he didn't. So by the time that the photographer got back to the police station to tell them what he saw, it was too late, and these clothes were never found, you know, they could have been anywhere for all we know. And Multiple years later, an investigation was done kind of on the police work in this case, and it was found within the days of the murder, a woman rang the police 3 times and the call was never answered, and left 3 voicemails saying please ring me, and it's thought this woman was like a key witness in the crime, but the police never got back to her, which I get they're busy, you know, they're going to miss phone calls, but not calling her back after the voicemails, like, it's very deliberate here. And the police decided to use a website for this crime called Homes, and it was basically like this new technology that the police had where they could store all information, and the important information would be like at the front of this website, and it made it a lot easier to like keep track of stuff and to solve cases sooner. But less than half the officers assigned to this case knew how to use it, so like officers would spend their time putting stuff on this website just for it not to be seen by the other half of the officers, and then the people who didn't know how to use it would try but kind of mess things up. So Holmes just turned out to be like a massive fail for this case. It really just hindered the investigation. And the police clearly had like racist bias because, you know, they didn't perform first aid on Stephen, they were slow with the investigation, and they were presuming that Stephen was a gangster and like he knew his attackers, he brought on the attack, he was expecting it, and instead of looking for like the actual people, they spent their time investigating like Stephen's family and looking into their like past to see if they had any like criminal records which had nothing to do with Stephen's death. They had 22 tip-offs about that gang I was talking about with the 5 boys, but yet they didn't even question them or talk to them, you know. I mean, at least question them with something. So Nelson Mandela came to the UK and he heard about this case and he was disgusted by the way the police were like dealing with it. So he did a press conference.
That some of our people, some of whom suffered in exile, underground, languished in jail, have themselves become corrupt. It is one of the greatest challenges that is facing us. The fact that freedom fighters who have well helped to win liberation have now put their claws deep in public resources, using them for their personal purposes.
And after this, the police basically stepped up their game and they took the boys in for questioning, but the boys, there were no help, you know, they said no comment to everything, even to their own names. One of the boys' questionings, I'm not sure who it was, it lasted 7 minutes. So that's how like bad the questionings were. And the boys' houses were searched, but minimal effort was put in, and they had a tip-off saying that the boys hid weapons under their floorboards, but the police that had this tip-off did not tell the police searching the houses, so obviously they didn't search under the floorboards. So like just there was lack of like communication here as well. And like obviously this was a month after like the crime had taken place, you know, the boys would have got rid of any evidence and weapons and stuff so they wouldn't get caught. The only thing they got from this was some clothing that matched the description of what like the witnesses said they were wearing, but you know, it could have like be confirmed or anything. And they put like a lineup, police lineup, and one of the boys was in this lineup, and Dwayne and multiple other witnesses picked this boy out. At this point, Neil Acorn was charged with the murder, and then later on Luke Knight was also charged with the murder, but then like another month later the prosecution dropped the charges so they didn't have enough evidence. The police carried out like an investigation to make sure they'd done everything right in this case, and the person who said this investigation was okay was the person who was in charge of the case. So like, obviously he's not going to be there like slating his team and stuff, so that was just so biased. I don't understand how they managed to get away with that. For a year this case went cold and the public kind of not lost interest, but obviously when the case isn't in the public eye all the time they are going to kind of forget about it and lose kind of interest. But police got a lot of like people campaigning still, you know, people still remembered, and they put a camera into a flat that Gary Dobson was like living in, and this camera could like pick up like sound and video. But like this was a year after the murder and they were hoping they'd hear the boys talk about the murder, but why would they be talking about it a year later? Like the only thing they picked up was the boys saying lots of racist slurs and like being racist, which kind of gave them motive for the attack. It could be used if they had more substantial evidence. Obviously Stephen's family were not happy with kind of how this case had like been dealt with, so they actually pulled it from like the Crown Prosecution Service, which is like the service that deals with all the cases in the UK, and they took it private to do their own trial against the boys, but they couldn't get information like enough evidence against 2 of the boys, so they just trialed Jamie Acorn, Gary Dobson and David Norris. And the biggest piece of evidence was that Dwayne had picked 2 of them out at this police lining, but they did have a few other bits of evidence as well. But they had a lot of risk with this because in this time the UK had a law called double jeopardy, which basically means that if someone is like proven not guilty of a crime, they cannot be tried for it again. So if this didn't go through and they didn't get charged, that was it, you know, they had one chance at this. And the biggest piece of evidence being Dwayne picking them out. Dwayne had to kind of prove he was reliable on the stand, but he couldn't prove this. So the biggest piece of evidence was thrown out, and after this the case kind of fell apart and all 3 boys were acquitted of the murder, and that was kind of it. And Stephen's death was just like written down as unlawful killing in a racist attack by a group of white youth. And Stephen's case was kind of out of the public eye for like about 4 years at this point, until the Daily Mail stepped in, and this is kind of the most known part of this case. And the Daily Mail have done some shady things, but I think this is an amazing thing they did. So on the 14th of Feb 1997, they had on the front line page of the newspaper, they had a title in all capital letters, murderers, with pictures of all 5 of the boys and their names. And it said underneath it, the man accuses these of killing. If we are wrong, let them sue us. This is a very risky move, you know, because they actually could have got sued, and none of the boys actually did sue, but like this is a very risky move, and that kind of brought back attention to this case. People started campaigning again for the police to do more, but the police couldn't do anything. There was no evidence, and you know they couldn't do anything, and the family were like so disappointed at this. They wanted justice. Then in 2005 the law was changed, so in some cases where like extreme crimes are taking place, like murder or rape, they could trial people twice if there was new substantial evidence. So at this point the police began to investigate again, and at this point, you know, it's 10 years later, they have a lot more like DNA testing, better technology, so there was a higher chance of them finding something they could use in court. And they did. So on the collar of Gary Dobson's jacket that he was apparently wearing, you know, they thought he was wearing, they found a tiny speck of blood. It was literally less than 0.5 millimeter in diameter, and it is thought that this blood came off whenever the knife was being drawn out of Stephen. It kind of splattered onto him, it was airborne and landed on his jacket, and this couldn't be like traced before, but this time it was, and it was a direct match to Stephen. It couldn't have been anyone else's blood. And they found fibres of Stephen's polo shirt on here as well, and an item of clothing that David Norris was thought to be wearing had some fibres of Stephen's hair. So in May 2011 they were both arrested and charged with the murder, and the trial took place later this year in November, and it lasted 2 months, and they were both found guilty of the murder, but because they were both under like age, you know, they were 16 and 17 when these crimes took place, they were like kind of tried as children, so they both got life in prison, but one of them got 15 years like minimum and one of them got 14 years minimum. So this kind of angered people, but at the same time it's understandable because they were children when this crime took place. I just find it so sad that like the other 3 gang members have never been charged with anything. Like some justice was found, but I think more justice needs to be found. But sadly without the evidence we can't charge them. An investigation was like done on the police in this case, and it was found they were very like corrupt, as we have guessed, and they were like racist, and they did not want to solve the case because of the colour of his skin. They presumed he was in a gang and he brought it on himself. And a police officer who used to work on this case actually came out and said that he was told to make the family look bad, so the public stopped campaigning for this case. So like honestly just terrible police work. On April 22nd, which is the day Stephen was murdered, since 2019 is now Stephen Lawrence Day in the UK. This was announced by Theresa May, and it's basically a day where the UK remembers Stephen Lawrence, and we kind of look into the crime that was committed and educate people on racism. But yeah, that is the end of this case. I just want to add a quick note at the end of this video. This is kind of dedicated to the Black Lives Matter movement going on, and even though it is not trending on Twitter, I am still supporting this campaign. I still want changes to be made. I am still linking stuff in the description, so check it out to sign some petitions that you might not have signed before, to educate yourselves further. And for the people who were saying that racism is not a thing in the police force in the UK, clearly it is. This case may have taken place years ago, but obviously it's still racist. And it's still happening to this day. It's just not really getting recorded, you know. The only reason this movement's taking place is because George Floyd's death was recorded, but if it wasn't, it still would have happened. But yeah, I'm glad some justice was found, but I feel like more should have been found. But I will see you all in the next video. Bye guys!